Hey guys, if you've been searching for something to play with a deep story that won't leave anyone indifferent, well, I've got good news for you. You've come to exactly the right place, because I've put together 15 of the most interesting single-player games that definitely deserve your attention. And I'm like 100% sure that in this list you'll find something for yourself. So without any long intros, let's get right into it. Let's go! Ghost of Tsushima. After the release of the sequel, which I actually talked about in my last video about new releases, we simply can't skip mentioning the original story. You know, this game can rightfully be called one of the best games about samurai, with the small correction that it's the best game specifically for the mainstream and probably even casual player like me. Because, as you know, there are plenty of unique and good projects about samurai besides Tsushima. There's like Sekiro, Samurai Warriors, Ninja Gaiden, and so on. But the developers at Sucker Punch managed to capture the mood of feudal Japan and samurai so perfectly that whenever anyone talks about games with samurai, the first thing that comes to mind is Tsushima. And yeah, some of you might reasonably ask, what's so special about this game? After all, it's basically just a traditional open-world game like the ones from Ubisoft. But here's the counter question. Is that really a bad thing? If the game world is well made and works like clockwork, making you want to explore it. You know, there are plenty of open-world games where after finishing the story, the game feels kinda done. The story's over and there's nothing left to do, and that's totally fine. In Tsushima, even after completing the main story, I was still interested in exploring this world, doing side quests, cutting down enemies in beautiful and spectacular ways, and just, you know, spending my time there. By the way, about the story itself, it's not perfect and isn't some kind of masterpiece, it's just understandable, and because of that, it's engaging. The game's story is first and foremost a warrior's story. A warrior with honor who has to shove that honor deep down because hard times are coming. Namely war, where all means are fair. In a way, Tsushima's plot is a story about the conflict between two sides. It's a story about how a samurai has to become what he's despised his whole life, a dishonorable killer, in order to save the residents of Tsushima Island. And this conflict will follow you throughout literally the entire game. You know, I want to talk about this game way more than I usually allow myself to, but that would take quite a bit of time, so I'll briefly sum it up. Tsushima is one of those games where beautiful visuals, a simple story, and an equally simple open world combine. But it's precisely this simplicity that makes the game attractive. Because you don't have to be something incredibly unique and complex to just be enjoyable to players. Gears of War 5. I don't remember who exactly, but once someone in the gaming industry said that story in shooters is like story in adult films. You can add it, sure, but it's not necessary. And man, how wrong that person was. Because over time, so many unique story-driven shooters came out that his statement completely loses all its meaning. Well, today we're talking specifically about the fifth part of Gears. In my opinion, probably the most spectacular game in the series that didn't get the attention it deserved, considering the excellent single-player campaign. The game once again tells the story of the bloody conflict between humans and the local scum. To be more specific, in the game they're called the Locust, Swarm, or Horde. You know, that doesn't really change the essence much. Because Gears 5 isn't just a good story-driven project, the game also doesn't forget about a pretty important factor for a shooter, namely gameplay. And here it's basically brought to perfection. Moving in this game, as well as shooting, is an incredible pleasure because every weapon feels different. Its weight and especially its power. That's exactly why shooting in this game never gets tiring, considering, you know, the game's not exactly short duration. If you love shooters and for some reason aren't familiar with this game, trust me, you definitely need to fix that. Titanfall 2. Look, I'm not going to waste time talking about how underappreciated this game was back in the day. And no, I'm not trying to put it down with that statement. Rather, I'm trying to convey the idea that many other creators have already told this story perfectly well without me. Those who aren't familiar with the game or have only heard a little about it probably think that Titanfall 2 is just another shooter with a futuristic theme and some titans. Like, not very interesting. However, behind that kind of thinking hides a real gem from 2016 that I've replayed more than once. Briefly about the game's story setup, it's the distant future, there's a war going on where both sides use big titans for combat. Basically, a giant machine controlled by a pilot. and the connection between pilot and Titan is on a pretty high level. Playing as the main character, you'll control the Titan BT. Probably one of those cases where there are essentially two heroes in the game, and both are fantastic. Actually, watching the interaction between both heroes throughout the entire game is an incredible pleasure, because the Titan here isn't just a pile of scrap metal, but a fully fledged, interesting character that you become attached to. Definitely those who've played through it will understand perfectly what I'm talking about right now. However, I want to praise not only the interesting story and narrative, even with its generic setup, but also the gameplay. Playing as a pilot, moving, and just getting around in this game is pure pleasure. It's one of those cases where fantastic movement was created 8 years ago, which later, if I'm not mistaken, partially carried over into Apex. Words can't describe how awesome it is to move in this game, and how smoothly and beautifully everything is animated at the same time. This is probably, one of those cases where you should experience the game yourself first to understand what I'm talking about. Rise of the Tomb Raider, the events of which move from hot deserts to the snowy Siberian wilderness. And personally for me, this is just a whole vibe, because I myself just love that kind of atmosphere, I guess. And also, I just can't help but point out the fact that this game came out way back in 2015, even on Xbox 360. So literally, it's almost a decade old. And yet, the game itself still looks absolutely stunning. And honestly, I have no idea how the developers managed to release such beauty on time for the already aging, by those standards, Xbox 360. And Rise of the Tomb Raider itself is the most familiar adventure about Lara Croft, done in the style of Uncharted. I mean, it's the perfect mix of dynamic and epic gameplay together with a good, moderately interesting story. I won't spoil anything here, but the setup is more than standard. Lara Croft goes searching for another adventure and will once again, and not for the last time, face off against another corporation with, you could say, similar goals. The game, as I said above, takes the perfect Uncharted formula and also adds a semi-open world that we can explore, study various tombs, and also upgrade the main character. If you love adventures like Indiana Jones, then trust me, you definitely shouldn't skip this. Star Wars Jedi Survival. If you missed this game at launch because it frankly didn't have human-level optimization, now's a great time to fix that. First of all, they finally brought the optimization up to standard in the game, so you can check it out now without any problems. Second, they recently removed de novo protection, which was ruining life not only for pirates but also regular players by overloading PCs. Now, about the game itself. This is primarily a story continuation of Fallen Order, where you'll play once again as the Jedi Cal Kestis and fight against the Empire. Gameplay-wise, the game didn't stray too far from the previous part, so while it's similar, there are still a couple of changes. For example, combat got affected. It became much more diverse and therefore more interesting. And the story itself became a bit more mature compared to the previous part, and probably even darker. In short, a pretty decent story-driven game in the Star Wars universe, because there are unfortunately few interesting story games in this universe. Even though it would seem, the universe is huge and there's still so much that could be told. Far Cry 5. In the Far Cry series, there are actually plenty of good games. Many people, for example, think that the third one is the most legendary, and I'm not going to argue that the third part is good. But if we're talking about the most atmospheric games in the series, then personally for me, the fifth part is the favorite, where small-town America was chosen as the setting. Obviously, this is a matter of taste, but Ubisoft at that time hit me right in the heart. So, perfectly capturing the mood of a small state captured by cultists, combined with fantastic music? That doesn't happen every time. By the way, about the cultists and the game's story in general. Here you're told the story of an unnamed police officer who arrives in Hope County to arrest the leader of the Eden's Gate cult, but in the end, everything goes to hell, as is tradition for the series. Actually, Far Cry as a whole is known for its villains. In the third part, it was the incredibly psychotic psychopath, Voss. And here, logically, it's the family of cultists who are genuinely terrifying. Joseph Seed, who serves as the head of the family here, isn't just some random homeless guy from the street, but a genuinely well-thought-out and cold-blooded villain who's interesting to watch. An important role in Far Cry 5 is played by the approach to creating the open world, which is as beautiful as you can possibly imagine. Small-town America here is, you could say, in all its glory. Dense forests, mountain rivers, American pickup trucks with great country music on the radio, and also small towns where every little detail is worked out to almost 100%. Well, and what seals the deal is the magnificent sound design. It's hard to describe in words, you just have to feel it yourself, I guess. Far Cry 5 is rightfully, for me personally, one of the best games in the series. Probably even better than 3. And therefore, I definitely think it's necessary to check out the game. Detroit Become Human, a game that came out from Quantic Dream back in 2018 and is still one of the best games in the interactive movie genre. This applies both to the game's story itself and its variability. There's so much of the latter that I think it'll be a while before anything similar appears in this genre. It feels like Quantic Dream raised the quality bar so high in Detroit that they themselves now don't know how to make a new game even better. In the game itself, you're told what seems at first glance to be a pretty generic story setup that we've seen in many films about robots. You know, the future, androids, they start to be oppressed and they develop consciousness, and eventually there's a war between humanity and robots. Pure classic from Blade Runner. However, despite the well-worn plot, everything is ultimately realized at a very worthy level, which is why I personally replayed the game more than once for sure, for different endings, of which there are quite a few. Like in previous projects from Quantic Dream, there isn't one main character here. The game's story is told through 3 different characters who may not be directly connected to each other, but the events of all 3 are very closely intertwined. For example, this was implemented very well in Heavy Rain, which I absolutely love. And also, the game looks incredibly cinematic and expensive. It's one of those cases where interactive movie isn't just a genre name, but also its complete embodiment in graphical terms. Forza Horizon 4. I don't know of a single arcade racing game with an open world right now that would be better than the Forza Horizon series. Well, maybe only the 6th part set in Japan, which I'm incredibly waiting for. It would seem that back then, open-world racing was pioneered by Electronic Arts with the NFS series, which hadn't yet gone downhill at that point. Where Most Wanted resonates in many people's hearts. However, it was Playground Games that managed to release and perfect, almost to perfection, the ideal hybrid of an arcade racer and a large open world. Better games in this genre at the moment, it seems, simply don't exist. Forza Horizon 4 has a couple of aces up its sleeve that people just love it for. Take the car roster, where there's a huge number of licensed cars available, each of which can be customized. Yeah, not like, super detailed, but nevertheless it's there. Physics also plays an important role. It would seem it's an arcade game, so the physics must be mediocre. Of course, compared to simulators like Assetto Corsa or Project Cars, it might seem exactly like that. But nevertheless, each car feels like it has weight, traction on different road surfaces, drifting, and especially different drive types. Plus, the game just has stunning graphics and overall open-world visuals. And what's funny, it also comes with stunning optimization, which only intensifies the enjoyment from the game. Not to mention the different seasons in the game, where you can cruise through the expanses of England in winter, spring, autumn, and also summer. In short, Forza Horizon 4 isn't just a racing game. It's a real automotive adventure that's perfect for fans of arcade racing. Spider-Man Miles Morales. Actually, to be honest, I would personally call the game more of a large, good DLC to the original Spider-Man game, rather than a separate part of the series. Although, I'll honestly say I enjoyed the game itself. Story-wise, it continues events after the finale of the first part, where the main Spider-Man, Peter Parker, decided it was time to take a short vacation with his girl, and for some time, Miles Morales will replace him. The main difference that immediately catches your eye is New York. In the first part, it was presented in, let's say, autumn time, and looked fantastic. Now, New York is presented in winter and still looks amazing. I played through the game right in winter, literally a couple weeks before New Year's, and the atmosphere is just incredible. I really recommend checking out the game during exactly that time period. Because I last experienced something similar playing Batman Arkham Origins, which also had a, let's say, Christmas atmosphere. The game itself, by the way, didn't really change much gameplay-wise compared to the first one. We still play as Spider-Man, who can beautifully fly around the city and fight enemies no less beautifully. The only thing is, Miles, unlike Peter, got way more combat abilities, which is pretty strange story-wise, but very spectacular in terms of animation and overall visuals. In short, if you're looking for a decent and not too long adventure for a couple of evenings, I highly recommend checking it out, especially during winter. Assassin's Creed Unity. A very ambitious game that became, at the time, a victim of terrible technical condition and bugs that the game was overflowing with. Because behind the terrible state at release was hiding a real gem in the Assassin's Creed series with a very atmospheric story, extremely advanced graphics level, and parkour that I still consider the best in the series. This game turned 10 years old last year, and looking at the footage, you wouldn't say, that, especially with mods, that the game came out in 2014. It still looks absolutely mind-blowing, especially regarding the detail of Paris and the massive crowds of people mentioned earlier. You know, Ubisoft is now commonly criticized at every turn, and I'm far from being one of those who wants to be the devil's advocate. But I just can't help but praise the studio for how they used to be able to convey the mood of different historical eras. Ever since the second part, I unexpectedly realized that I actually enjoy studying history, at least a little. And specifically touching on this aspect, the game tells about Paris and the Revolution, which looks very epic. Among other things, the game also has fantastic parkour. Yeah, it was decent before too, but sometimes janky. But specifically in Unity, it's, you could say, perfectly polished. And how your character will move is now only up to you and your skills. And yeah, once again, I'm not saying a word about the story, simply because I don't want to spoil. But just know that it's somewhere by my feeling, probably on the level of the legendary second part, though it falls slightly short. Metro Exodus. Not too long ago, literally a couple months ago, I replayed the first and second Metro games and changed my opinion about Metro 2033 for the better. Because back in the day, I played through the first part at a not particularly, let's say, conscious age, and basically didn't understand what the true subtext of the story were. However, just as I considered Metro Exodus the best game in the series a couple years ago, I still think so. Don't get me wrong, but the story set up in the first two parts is, of course, decent, but, like, not quite it. Both parts chase after dark mutants, which, while cool, doesn't feel as, like, grounded, I guess. Because Metro Exodus is primarily a very simple and incredibly heartfelt story about how Artyom and his friends aren't trying to save the world or anything like that. They're simply looking for a safe place and a new home where they can live peacefully and start a family. Well, and for this, our group of friends had to leave Moscow and go on a real journey literally across all of Russia, where each location is memorable and touches the soul. Another important role for immersion in the story is played by dialogues that you can hear while riding on the train. In many other games, dialogues are often skipped because they might be written so-so, but not in this game. Here, you literally want to approach each character and listen to their story, their thoughts about what's happening, or just sometimes sit with someone. There are very few games, actually, where dialogues can be so engaging. And Metro Exodus itself is first and foremost a finally properly concluded story of Artyom, in my opinion, with a sad but perfect ending, if we're talking about the good ending. Overall, one of the most soulful and atmospheric games I've had the chance to play. I definitely recommend checking it out to literally everyone. Resident Evil 2 Remake. In 2019, Capcom Studio went and showed how to make remakes of cult classic games and bring them back to life, but now for a modern audience. In a way, the remake of the second Resident Evil part is, you could say, analogous to Doom, when old projects are brought back to life but done with soul and quality. Just so you understand, you could say Resident Evil's remake started the trend for all these newfangled remakes, though most of them aren't even close to the level of quality that the Japanese at Capcom achieved 5 years ago. Actually, Resident Evil 2 is also the story of a pretty iconic series hero, Leon Kennedy, who in a way even became the face of the franchise. Here you're told the story of a still very young and inexperienced Leon who's just joining the police force. But as is typical for Resident Evil, everything can't just be good. The hero arrives in Raccoon City in the midst of a zombie epidemic, where he, as well as his pretty attractive friend Claire, will have to survive in harsh conditions. Despite the game being 5 years old, it still looks pretty darn good, especially if you touch on facial animations and zombie behavior when shot. If you shoot at the limbs of local walkers, be prepared for them to eventually just fly off. The game also has various bosses, as is typical for the Resident Evil series, especially the local tyrant, and also puzzles. And yeah, puzzles here are one of those cases where they're genuinely interesting to solve, not when they just suffocate the whole gameplay. A truly fantastic remake of an equally fantastic game of its time. I definitely recommend checking it out. Uncharted 4. Here, similar to Far Cry, I played through the entire series of games and can confidently state that the fourth part, as well as the second, are probably the best games in the series. Yeah, the first and third parts are also good games, nobody's arguing. However, that level of polish that Naughty Dog achieved in the fourth and second parts, they didn't quite manage to repeat in the previous games. Actually, Uncharted 4 can be described as a magnificent adventure that nobody should miss. It's actually funny that Uncharted 4 came out. It would seem 8 years ago already, but still holds the bar of fantastic quality. The game is good and sometimes even several heads above many modern games. It still has stunning graphics and location design and overall presentation. My jaw literally almost dropped when in the story we arrive in a, let's say, abandoned city. Those who played probably understand perfectly what I'm talking about. Actually, locations in Uncharted 4, as well as action, are literally separate topics that I want to, write about for several sentences again. But I've once again extended the video runtime, because besides everything mentioned above, the game also has a good story. It's a story about how Nathan Drake goes on his last journey, which is sad on one hand, and on the other hand, quite logical and right, I guess. Especially if you know what happened in the previous games in the series, which it's very unfortunate didn't come out on PC because they more than deserve it. Uncharted 4 is simply a magnificent action movie that sometimes feels like a real full-fledged expensive film, and not many studios manage to implement this so competently. I definitely recommend checking it out. Dead Space Remake. A game that, honestly, I expected absolutely nothing from. Back in the day, I played through the original, and then the whole series, and was, completely delighted in the end. But as soon as I learned about the remake, I honestly thought it would turn out, well, probably mediocre. At least because it was handled by Electronic Arts, who I don't have much respect for. Well, at least until they were bought out by the Arabs. And also because the workers from Visceral Games, responsible for the original Dead Space trilogy, had long left the studio. But even with all these concerns, the remake surprisingly turned out great, with the same dark and oppressive atmosphere as the original. And due to the fact that the game is now on a new engine, the game started looking significantly better. Moreover, this affected not only graphics but gameplay too, in the sense that cutting up local necromorphs into pieces became much more satisfying. From each shot, you visually see the consequences on the monster, whose limbs and other body parts you can see chunks flying off from. And you can understand how many more shots are left to finish off the local monstrosity. Well, story-wise, although the game remained faithful to the original, it supplemented it pretty well, connecting the remake with the books and generally the entire universe that came out back in the day after the original. Overall, a remake of a game that many didn't expect much from, but in the end it turned out genuinely excellent. Highly recommend checking it out. Mafia Definitive Edition. I'll be honest, as a kid I tried playing through the first Mafia, but unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I never finished the game. Why, fortunately? Well, it's simple. As kids playing through many games, we can't fully, let's say, understand them. But you know that feeling when sometimes you sit down to rewatch an old film or cartoon and start noticing way more details and meaning than when you watched it as a child? With Mafia, the situation is exactly the same, and the remake they released so you could check out the game, I'll be honest, is just fantastic. At least I'm judging from the perspective of someone who didn't finish the original, and I personally enjoyed the remake. Maybe those who played the original didn't like it, but to each their own. Basically, the first Mafia is a fantastic and probably even much more mature crime story than the GTA series of games. A story about a person who, not by his own will, gets dragged into the criminal world and now must not only survive there but also prove that he's a worthy and righteous person. I want to praise the game for just a huge number of things. First, the atmosphere. It's just incredible here, and few games have managed to convey the mood of America during Prohibition, where music played an important role in this. I don't know about you, but before I played Mafia 2 and also the remake of the first one, I wasn't particularly interested in old tracks. But after playing through these games, more than one track went into my personal playlist. I'm sure some of you had the same experience. In short, a fantastic remake of an equally fantastic game of its time.